Have you ever made a plan with great intentions, perhaps even a plan to serve the Lord, and you've made all kinds of calculations, and all of a sudden, God starts to make it clear that's not what He wants. And perhaps He even takes you in a completely different direction from what you were intending. Today, we're going to see in First Chronicles that exact same situation examined. And we're going to look at how God can overrule our intentions, how we can make plans, yet God has other plans. And we're going to talk about that today when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I hope this is a blessing to you. And if it is, think about giving the super thanks down below where you can help us financially continue this kind of content. And we hope you do. And listen, we're going to continue our study in First Chronicles. Let's get into chapter 28. This last two chapters summarize the last days of David's life. Before he dies, he's got some things on his mind that he wants to communicate, and that's these last two chapters. And today we're going to be in chapter 28, and we're going to see what there is for us in the Word today. Okay, you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, Kyle. I'm going to have you read the first verse and make some comments about it.
Now David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the princes of the tribes and the commanders of the divisions that served the king, and the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, and the overseers of all the property and livestock belonging to the king and his sons, with the officials and the mighty men, even all the valiant men.
Okay. Anything in there sound familiar?
I know there was another point in the chapter where it talked about the army and the structure and stuff like that.
Okay, last chapter, we talked about the structure, the divisions with the generals and the valiant men. It's also talking about all the officials. David gets together out in the various tribes, including all the military command structure. And then he gets those together, which is a summary. We know who these people are because we've had back in chapter 28 and also all the way back to chapter 11, where it's talking about the mighty men of David. So he's getting basically a convention of the leadership of Israel. That makes sense?
Yeah.
And then he has some statements for this assembled crowd. So we're going to keep in mind who the assembled crowd is that David is talking to, but also keeping in mind who the readers are. Remember, these are people that are reading this at the end of the 70 years of captivity in Babylon, when they're returning to rebuild the nation, rebuild the temple, rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So we got to keep both of those audiences in mind as we're reading this chapter. And we're going into here. I want you to read the next three verses from 2 to 4. And these are really the key verses that I've picked out. In fact, I've done a great artist job there in my notes. If you see this key, that just tells me this is a key verse, and I've highlighted it a little bit here. But I want you to read these three verses and see what we can pull out here.
Okay. Then King David rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my brethren and my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. So I had made preparations to build it. But God said to me, 'You shall not build a house for my name because you are a man of war and have shed blood.' Yet the Lord, the God of Israel, chose me from all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever. For he has chosen Judah to be a leader, and in the house of Judah, my father's house, and among the sons of my father, he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel."
Okay. Now, in purple, I've taken some words that are going to be repeated words through the rest of the chapter. We'll set those aside for now. But right now, I want to go back up to verse 2 and look at that little phrase, "I had intended." Okay? So
Yeah.
David gets up in front of everybody and says, "I had a plan to build the temple." And then verse 3 has those first two key words, "but God." And he said, basically, God said, "No, you're not going to build a temple." And then verse 4 has the three words, yet the Lord. Now, the thing I want us to take away from there is thinking about this idea of perhaps our intentions. We had an intent and a plan, but
Mhm.
God overrides that plan. And just because he overrides that plan, he has a different plan for us. It's not like he sets us aside and we're worthless. It just says, no, I got a different way. And early in my Christian life, the one thing I learned was to make my plans and write them down in pencil because they were going to change and I needed to erase them and change them because God was going to change the plan that I had to what he wanted to do. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Now, that sets up the rest of this chapter because David is going to explain how the yet is being fulfilled. So he says,
Okay.
I wanted to build a temple, but God said no. He had somebody else in mind and he has his son in mind. It's very interesting. I'll show you in my notes here. It said the reason that God said I couldn't build a temple was because in verse 3, I was a man of war and have shed blood. Now, if you go to chapter 22, verse 9, where it first talks about Solomon.
Okay. Behold, a son will be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. For his name will be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days.
Okay, so Solomon is going to be a man of peace, a man of rest. Solomon's not going to be going out with the army to fight because his kingdom is going to be a kingdom of peace as compared to David, who was a man of war and had to fight for it. Now, that's not
Hmm.
saying military men that God doesn't have a plan for them. He does. And he's got a plan for David even. But there's two things. He's a man of war and he shed blood. And I think that the phrase shed blood is not talking about his warfare where he fought for the nation, but when he fell out of fellowship with God and sinned with Bathsheba. You remember what he did?
Yeah, he kills Uriah the Hittite.
He arranged for the husband of Bathsheba to be killed. So he's got a man with a bloody past. Let's put it that way. And because of that, God says, no, I don't want you to build it. I've got a man in mind to build it who's going to be a man of peace.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if we go back here, we start to see that pattern where it said, I had intended, but God said to me, you're not going to build it. Yet I've got a different plan, right? I want you to flip over to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. This has been one of my verses that I've gone to many times in my life when I had an intention and God overrode those intentions. Go ahead.
Okay. The mind of a man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps.
Okay, now we see that verse exactly lived out here where David is saying, I had a plan, I had an intention, but God overrode that. So I put as the key to this chapter that we make plans, but God rules. Okay, there is another very interesting thing in these verses that I made known up here, and we're going to talk about that in these next verses. But this key of whose kingdom is it? At the end of verse 4, he says, it was his pleasure to set up a kingdom to be God over Israel forever. And he set me up to be king over all of Israel. So we can ask the question here. Read verse 5 and 6.
Of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, your son Solomon is the one who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him.
Now read verse 7.
I will establish his kingdom forever, if he resolutely performs my commandments and my ordinances, as is done now.
Now, we could talk about this, that as a ruler, the kingdom, he is going to resolutely perform the commands and ordinances of God. But the thing that I noticed was this up here in verse 5, it says he's going to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord. So whose kingdom is it?
God's.
It's the Lord's kingdom. And then he says, he's chosen me to establish his kingdom, and I'm going to establish my kingdom. So what I got from that was I'm going to establish his kingdom forever, and I'm going to be king. And I really got that idea here that David understood he is going to be a king. And the people coming out of the captivity of Babylon understood that David was the line of the forever king that was ultimately going to be Jesus, the Messiah.
Yeah.
And it was David's kingdom, but it was David's kingdom under God's kingdom. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So all he is doing is being a steward of the greater kingdom. And it's not just David's line, it's the plan God has for David's line that's going to be forever. And that's important to the people coming out of Babylon who are saying, we're interested in the line of David because that line is going to produce our Messiah someday. Now, the other word that's repeated there a lot, and I'm going to go here, that we see is the word forever. God, this is God's doing. It isn't David choosing. This is God choosing. And he says, I will establish his kingdom. Now, this is interesting because this is a quote. God is speaking. And if you notice the H there, the H is not a capital H. This is up here, the kingdom of the Lord. But down here, I'm going to establish his kingdom. This is a quote. He said to me, right there in verse 6, God is speaking to him. This is part of the quote. I'm going to have your son, and I'm going to establish the son's kingdom. So Solomon is going to be a king under the king of God. And as the king, he has the ability to overrule the intents of the heart. And that kingdom that he is going to establish through David and Solomon and through following descendants. It's an interesting fact that one of the men from Babylon that is sent back to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city is Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is a direct descendant of David. So even after the captivity, they had somebody from the line of David that was going to be their leader. So that became very important, that the line of Messiah, the house of Messiah, was going to be a forever house. Now, we see the last proclamation David makes is to his son, because you see in verse 9, and this is a great verse for a Father's Day sermon. What would a father say to his son? We can ask ourselves as Christian fathers, what is the message we want to give to our sons as a message for life, right? So I want you to read verse 9 with this in mind. This is David speaking to his son in David's last days. And he's given this last message to Solomon, who's going to take over in the succession plan of the king. Go ahead and read verse 9.
As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever.
Now, that's a great message for a father to give to his son. You look back in that, know the Lord. In other words, have a personal relationship with God and then serve him, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. I really like that idea of consciously serve the Lord. And then it says, because the Lord searches all hearts and he understands every intent of the thoughts. Now, just earlier, God had overruled the intent that David had, right? So he's telling his son, listen, serve the Lord, and the Lord really knows what's going on inside your heart and what your intentions are. I went to Psalm 139, the first and the last verses, that God searches our hearts and he knows every intentions. It's a great place to go. What David is saying to Solomon and what every Christian father should be saying to their sons is, have a personal relationship with the Lord, have an intent and a desire to serve him, and to do it knowing that he searches our hearts and our intentions, and therefore we need to surrender to the commands and provisions of his authority. It's a great Father's Day message. By the way, when I was a pastor, I preached that message on a Father's Day, and it worked great. So if we go back and say that his kingdom will be forever, but if you do not follow the Lord, if you do not seek him, if you do not go after him, but you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Now, notice what is being rejected in that last phrase.
Solomon is being rejected as a king.
Okay, the person would be rejected,
Mhm.
not the kingdom. So he's saying here that if Solomon messes up, or any future king in the line of Messiah messes up, God may very well forsake him, but the covenant of the kingdom stays intact.
Okay.
For people coming out of the Babylonian captivity, they went into the captivity because they were not serving the Lord.
Mhm.
So he allowed them to be taken. And now they're being released, and he's allowing them to come back with the realization that the Lord can forsake the person and still keep the plan intact.
Yeah.
Okay? That's why it's important for us to stay in fellowship as we serve the Lord, because he can reject our service and still keep the plan intact. So I take that as a nugget out of this verse. Now, he's basically talking about his provision for the temple. And starting in verse 11, he starts talking about his plan. And he says, I got a plan for the porch and a plan for the courts and a plan for the rooms. Remember when we did that little demonstration of what the temple looked like, and there were offices all the way around it, where the priests and the storerooms all the way around? That was all David's plan. He's basically saying here to the whole leadership of the nation that I've planned this out, that I've made the final provision for the temple. I've made the plan. And he goes all the way down. He's talking about in verse 13, I've talked about the division of priests and Levites. This is almost a summary of the earlier chapters of First Chronicles, right? And then he says in verse 13, I set aside for all the utensils of service in the house of the Lord. And verse 14 talks about, I had the golden utensils, the weight of gold, and all the utensils for every kind of service, silver utensils for every kind of service, and gold in verse 15. And it struck me as I was reading this, and David is laying out his plan for all this gold and silver, and we're going to talk about that also next week. Back in chapter 22, he talks about the fact that he had tons and tons of gold and silver laid out and planned for the utensils and the temple, even the walls of the temple were going to have that. And while I was reading that, it struck me, and I've always wondered this, when Babylon came in and conquered Israel and conquered Jerusalem, why did they destroy the temple?
I don't know.
And in Rome, in 73 AD, when Rome takes the temple of Herod, why does he destroy the temple? Why didn't he dedicate it to a different god or do something else with it? He destroys it. And one of the reasons is because built into the temple was all this treasure, built into the walls. And the only way to get all this gold and silver out of this inlaid walls was to take the walls apart, melt all that gold and silver out so you could get it out.
Gotcha.
And the treasures were huge. When Babylon came in and took it, you remember that Babylon made this big deal of taking all the utensils from the temple because they were solid gold and silver as prescribed by David when they built it. So these things were literally worth their weight in gold or silver. So a great treasure. Now, in Ezra, when the people are being released to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, one of the things Cyrus does is he sends all of the utensils from the Babylonian captivity for the temple, which was a great treasure, he gave back to Israel. And when we look at this kind of a list of all the gold and silver things, the tables were made out of silver. There were gold lampstands, all kinds of gold and silver that were returned to Israel. So the people reading this, David's plan, are saying, now we have a chance to reestablish that same exact plan with the same treasures that Babylon took. So
that's cool.
We see this in this chapter. David is rehearsing all the things that God, and I took this as the yet. Remember in that first verse where we have a plan, yet God overrides us because he has a different plan? You're right here. Here, I have the note. 3,750 tons of gold and 41,250 tons of silver. We know that from chapter 22, verse 14. So
Okay.
Has this huge thing. And in Ezra chapter 5, verse 13 to 15, we see that Cyrus returns all that stuff. So all of this down, the rest of this chapter almost is this idea of David's plans. And then go ahead and read verse 20.
Then David said to his son Solomon, Be strong and courageous and act. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished.
Now, put that statement into the context of I had a plan and God overruled my plan. So now what? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if I've got a plan in my life and I'm going to go before the Lord, ask him for his blessings, and he says, nope, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to do something else. That actually happened to me in my life. I had a great plan, and God said, no, I got a different plan for you. Then it's up to us to be strong and courageous in the new plan. And it says, be strong and courageous and act. Did you notice that word? Do not fear, be dismayed. The Lord will be with you. Okay. So I really take that as the idea of his yet. Okay. We have a plan. God says, but no, yet I have another plan. And in that yet is a plan of action for us to be blessed.
Okay.
And that's a great takeaway from this chapter. We see David really explaining. We can go to the last verse here, and it's basically a recap. And go ahead and read that verse 21.
Now behold, there are the divisions of the priests and the Levites for all the service of the house of God, and every willing man of any skill will be with you in all the work for all kinds of service. The officials also and all the people will be entirely at your command.
Okay, now I underlined in red, will be with you. Okay, now when I was a pastor and I looked at the work that God had called me to do, I was overwhelmed. I knew God was going to bless me, but I was overwhelmed with what I needed to do. And there's a verse there that says, don't worry, be strong, be courageous, act on my plan, and I will bring team members to help you. You see that? He said, I'm going to provide help, and they will help you in accomplishing the plan. So the yet isn't, I'm going to send you out all by yourself and survive. Good luck. No, he said, I'm going to bring people alongside you who are going to help you. And that really leads us into the very last chapter. He's still talking to the commanders and to the officials of the kingdom. And all through this chapter, he's been talking to them and to his son. But he's talking to his son in front of them. Any comments or anything about this chapter?
Yeah, I thought it was just an interesting recap on a lot of the stuff we've already covered. Like you were saying, chapter, I think you said 22, but he's rehashing a little bit of what's already been said, but it's all in the context of David talking to these leaders and Solomon.
And his son, yeah. And it's a recap of chapter 21 and a recap all the way back to 11 with the valiant men and the mighty men. So his last state of the union, he's addressing a recap of all the things that have been recorded in First Chronicles. We've been talking about God ruling the details of our lives and how we make plans, and he might very well change them. I want to recommend a playlist of 3 videos on how to know God's will for your life when he perhaps has a different plan than what you intend. How to tell. And it's a great video series, and I hope you enjoy it. You can hit the link and go to the playlist and see what's available to you. And I hope you subscribe and hit the like button. We're going to continue in our study next week. And until then, God bless you.